Hello there, my name is Merapelo Letebele, the coordinator of Selalelo, a program sponsored by MORE, the Movement in Omaha for Racial Equity. This show is about getting Africans talking amongst themselves about things that are of interest to them. We will be talking colonialism and its legacy. We'll be talking gender relations in Africa and touching up on the elusive dream of African unity. Today, I am hosting a gentleman from Eswatini, former Swaziland, and he can introduce himself.
Hi, thanks for hosting me in this beautiful platform of yours. My name is Manxoba Nxumalo in Swaziland.
So, Manxoba, we are in Southern Africa, and do you have any visible legacies of colonialism in Swaziland? How far was Swaziland bogged up in this colonial quagmire?
So, of course, we were colonized by the British, and we got our independence in 1968. But it was carefully and beautifully crafted as something called protectorate. But remember, initially, we were far bigger size than we are right now. But because of the many issues that happened in Southern Africa, the Mfecane Wars, but also the expansion of the colonial project in South Africa, the creation of Bantustans and many other things eventually led to Swaziland shrinking in size and becoming what it is. So, but the British came into the country on the so-called invitation by the authorities to become what they called, and we became what is called British protectorate. But otherwise, you talk of what legacies of colonialism do. I mean, I could just give you a simple example. We still have our roads named by colonial masters. One of our stadiums is called Prince William Stadium, obviously named after Prince William of the UK. We still have most of our education system. We still have most of our Christian doctrines copied and taken from the Western, or rather the British in particular. So even in the monarchy itself, the propping up of the monarchy and how it became is to a large extent an influence of our colonial.
So can we talk about the monarchy then? What is the arrangement? Because usually the epitaph of Swaziland is always Africa's last absolute monarchy or something like that. So who is in government and how does it work? Because, you know, I'm from a purely democratic country, and as much as I understand how Lesotho and Swaziland operate on a small level, I do lack the knowledge. Is the king the one who's in complete control, or what's happening?
Yeah. They normally describe Swaziland as Africa's last absolute monarch, but I think it's sub-Saharan Africa. First of all, we are an absolute monarchy, as you correctly point out. We are a kingdom ruled by King Eswatini III, who's the latest in a lineage of so many kings since the founding of the country in the 1800s. We are an absolute monarchy where the king rules both as an executive head of state, but also as a ceremonial figure. Political parties are banned. We have a system called Tinkundla electoral system, where you can only get to parliament through an individual merit. But all political power is centered around the king. The king is above the constitution. The king is above the judiciary. Basically, the three arms of the state is immune from prosecution and to be sued in his personal and official capacity. He controls the country's biggest sovereign wealth fund. He's the sole shareholder. When it was crafted, that charter around that established Dilio, it said it's an organization or a company made on behalf of Swazis, and the king is a trustee on behalf of Swazis. It was made through the collective contribution of every homestead, which gave out at least one cow to the king, to then his father, King Sopo, to establish this fund. And this fund was meant to buy back land from departing colonial bureaucrats. So yeah, we operate like that. This Nkundla system was suggested by the king through the influence of some of the apartheid advocates who designed this system that would not allow these foreign political parties to mess with our idyllic, beautiful culture, tradition, and monarchy. But we are not a typical democratic country if judged by the standards of multi-party democracy and all that. Also, we borrowed the Westminster system, We have a House of Senate, we have a Senate.
Do you have the freedom then to talk about the political situation in your country or not? Would you get in trouble for talking about it?
No, sources speak about it and they routinely criticize the system, they fight against it, they do all sorts of things. Of course, the monarch and his family have had a tight grip over the country's politics, very well entrenched in the economy, and there's been a pushback by the people to try and reform the system, try to at least prune the powers of the monarchy to ensure that they have at least an elected prime minister with executive authority. But of course, the monarchy has not given in any shape and form. There were many people who thought that the coming of the 2005 constitution, by the way, the country was ruled by a decree from 1973 when political parties were banned, right up to 2005 when the new constitution was promulgated. But all it did, the constitution, was to codify the decrees and the law and the powers of the king into a national constitution, and leading to almost a continuation of the same old political establishment that bans political parties, that prefers individual merit as a form of attaining political office.
I did see, I think, this past week about somebody a political dissident of some sort, who was murdered by the authorities. Is it true? Do those kind of things happen where, people who are against the monarchy are hurt in different ways? Or
yeah, Tulani Masego you're talking about, and it became a huge global issue.
What was his name again?
Tulani Masego. Tulani Masego. So he was murdered, assassinated at his home with his wife. Became a huge global story. The UN issued a statement. The US, every government that matters, South Africa, UK, Kenya, you name it, the protests in various countries of the world because of the Tulani Masego assassination. He was a prominent human rights activist at the center of the fight for political reform in the country, and at the center of a new constitution that would unlock the very restricted political environment. But to be more pointed to your question, you want to find out if people do get criticized. As I'm speaking now, some members of parliament were inside the parliament who revolted against the system and fought to say we have to prune the powers of the king. They are just too much. It makes not just him to be accountable, but people hide under his skin when they have to be held accountable. So many businesses, shady businesses, get protection from the blanket immunity that they get when they are said to be working under the instruction of the king, and a variety of other things. So when that revolt started in parliament and joined by a majority of the country, there were many people who eventually were killed because there was an uprising at a national scale, and the soldiers came out, killed between 70 and 80 Swazis, and there was wide-scale torching of buildings. Many of the activists were forced into exile. As I'm speaking right now, one of the members of parliament, for example, was forced into exile in the UK. Two of the members of parliament who instigated and started this revolt against the powers of the king and also to reform the entire political establishment. They were charged arbitrarily with terrorism and instigating chaos.
Wow.
And they're currently in jail. So that's just to show in the most recent case how the establishment treats those who strengthen their political stranglehold.
That's all very shocking because I realize how rusty my current affairs is. Do you think that as much as the Swazis want to clip some of the powers of the king, do you think they want democracy, or they want just a reformed form of traditional leadership? What do they want? Do they want democracy?
In the context of Swaziland, it depends what democracy means. For example, in other countries, democracy means everyone must be elected. So kingship by its very nature is undemocratic. So if you're talking of a republic, yes, some small sections of the country are calling for a complete republic and banning of political parties and full democracy. But in the majority, people seem to coalesce around the idea that we could still have the monarchy that is only ceremonial in the mold of Lesotho, Britain, Spain, Norway, and a variety of other places. But also that there's a new strand of thought that says if the idea of a full republic and a monarchy are not mutually exclusive, you have a monarchy in Botswana, but you do have kings and chiefs. You have a monarchy in South Africa, but it's a republic. You have a republic in Ghana, but there are chiefs and kings. So there are some people who are contending with all of that. There has not been a very strong sentiment that we need to do away with the entire feudal structure, including the king, the chiefs, and all of that, and establish a post-kingship republic in the mold of France or Russia, in the 1800s.
Okay, very interesting. Now, because I am more interested in regional integration, what are your views on Malema in South Africa, who's becoming even much more popular by the day, when he talks about elimination of borders in African countries so that there can be this integration? What are your views? And
yeah, look, first of all, I can answer this at various levels. The first level is that there's power in numbers.
Mm-hmm.
If Africa is going to develop, it has got to eliminate these small, insignificant states. Your Swaziland, Lesotho, Botswana, Rwanda, many of these very small, insignificant states. If you coalesce together as a people, especially close-knit countries and nationalities, where the cultures are almost the same, languages are almost the same, you put those together, they get to bargain with the world with the strength of numbers. So there's power in numbers. Also, if you are telling me a country like Swaziland, whose GDP is less than the money that Oprah Winfrey has, an individual, and you have Swaziland going to the UK, to China, to Russia, to the US to negotiate some trade agreements with what? So those countries are really colonial outposts, or to prop up some small leaders that are going to be inconsequential in the bigger scheme of things. Politics of scale are very important. The second thing is that there's not going to be a development of one country in Africa without the development of all. Because what is going to happen is that if South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Ethiopia, all of these big economies, Congo, if they were to develop as islands in a sea of poverty around them, we will see a lot of migration to those countries. And in return, there'll be a lot of xenophobia, there'll be a lot of pushbacks and conflict as well. So any level of development it may start inward, but it must have the continental scale in terms of how you get everyone. So that means, in essence, you've got to start to look at free movement of trade, free movement of people, and all of that. But also, number three, we have to build regional powerful blocks. And these do not necessarily mean that they need not be a passport or some form of identity for you are in Botswana.
Or any measure of control.
Yes. I've lived in Europe. The US is a United States, which is different states united together. Europe, they have integrated. You look at their league, football, for example. They have a European league, continental league for individual players to play. They move around Europe and play around. Even in terms of movement, you have the Schengen visa. You can travel so many countries. That's a form of borderless Europe. So we do the same thing. They, in Southern Africa, for example, they were purporting the idea of a universal driver's license. So I have a driver's license from Swaziland. I can drive in Botswana. I can drive in Zimbabwe. I can drive in Mozambique and South Africa. So that's how you start. If I have a national ID, and then I can go to South Africa, and then I can use the same to go to Zimbabwe, to go everywhere, And all that it marks is that I have moved from this place to another. So I think there's the logic of borderless Africa, to me, makes sense, but it's being bastardized by people opposed to this Pan-Africanist idea. Because, for example, they think that a borderless Africa means a borderless South Africa, surrounded by countries with borders. It cannot happen in South Africa alone. It'd be silly to do so. It would have to be at a continental level. And we also know that the free trade agreement by the African Union talks to the same agenda. So there's a lot of wisdom to be looked at really taking back the debates that were fought between Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere around exactly how do we integrate the continent. We may not agree around the nuances, but let the principle be set that we have to create one Africa.
Okay, now looking at what you just said in mind, I know Botswana, Namibia now, cross each other's borders with just national IDs. Talks are still ongoing to do the same with Zimbabwe. I think that's like a second layer of the slow easing into a much bigger thing, like you said. But for instance, what else do you think we should be looking at in terms of how of integrating or at least opening up each other's countries a little bit more for that final idea to take root? I know that the AU has to be the guiding force, right? But we see the speed at which the AU is moving, and there is no real impetus or motivation for countries to do any of those things. So what can Southern Africa?
I'll tell you something. Yeah. There are two things that I think Southern Africa can do as a start to lead the process. You don't have to wake up tomorrow and decree that there's now a borderless Africa, we are now one people. It don't work. But I'll tell you three important things, cultural things that would be a seismic shift. The first one is language. We have to have a common language. We have to agree that we are going to use, if it's Swahili, we're adopting that, let it be Swahili, and whatever the case. And to do that is very simple. You introduce it in the school, you begin to modestly start to make it a medium of communication in institutions of power, parliament, and all of that. You put it in the education system that they must learn Swahili, they must learn whatever language that we agree on, but I guess Swahili is spoken by a number of countries, at least in East Africa and Tanzania, which is kind of closer to us this side. So you first of all, so the first thing we do, we begin to understand each other, because some of the barriers are being created because we don't know, we don't speak to each other, we don't understand each other. So we start to speak the same language, it begins to ease up the whole conversation about us being one people. And the second thing is also about promoting culture. There's an idea that Thabo Mbeki, who's a giant in the struggle for Pan-Africanist thought and thinking. One of the things that I agree with him was that and he was speaking in the context of South Africa, he says, we have to have the African equivalent of Al Jazeera, Russia TV, BBC, and CNN, so that we begin to know each other more. There's very little I know about Mozambique, just next door. But there's a lot I know about the UK, about Russia, about China, about everything. Why? Because they've got a cultural influence, and someone calls it a cultural vortex that comes through watching film, watching television, social media, and everything. It's molding us in a particular direction. So if you take television as a tool of cultural integration, we begin to see stories of Zimbabweans in our television. We begin to hear news of what's happening in Botswana in our television. And we begin to read stories of culture, of politics, of history from Namibia, in Swaziland. Then I have more interest to know and gradually understand and see Namibians as people closer to me. But if I'm unable to hear or see anything about Namibia, and I don't even speak their language and can never understand them, then we seem to be so far apart. Yet you meet Namibians in a conference in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, and you're talking and you realize there's so much in common, and you are angry at yourself that you don't know much about this country and these people. Yet these people are just like you in every way possible.
The Western countries have done so well to export their cultures to us remotely through television. Now we are all aspiring to be like them just from watching them on TV. There are no, except in South Africa, but there are not a whole lot of white populations in the rest of African countries. Yet we still aspire for the Western things. Some of us were born after the white people had left, post independence. And yet we are more in tune with, Western cultures than we are of our own. But I'll tell you one thing. I think Nigeria is doing well because you see how Nigerian movies have made a headway into the first time I saw a Nigerian movie was 15 years ago. And there was a time when even my own mother was glued to the television screen all the time watching Nigerian movies. I'm saying this to say there's so much merit in what you're saying. And now you'll see people on the street just clowning in a Nigerian accent because the influence is coming. And I do agree with you that that is a very important tool that needs to be looked into. Anyway, now can we talk a little bit about global racism? We may not be experiencing racism in Southern Africa, but African Americans are. People in many other Black people in other continents are still being treated really, really poorly. And also, I know it is because people don't really understand what we are about. Do you think that there's a chance that if all the Black people could find ways to get closer together, that we could also feel aggrieved by what's happening to other Black people elsewhere in the world and be able to rise together and at least speak against racism to help to, I mean, it's happening even right here in the continent, up there in North Africa, where they're still enslaving Africans.
No, that's a very good question to ask. And I'll tell you, I have a slightly different response to what you would find on the internet if you were asking. I'm not for Africans whining and complaining about racism, ill treatment. I do not believe the world owes us anything. This is a cutthroat world, dog-eat-dog world. It's survival of the fittest. It's capitalism, one of the most brutal cold systems. That's the first point I want to say, that we are not going to help the cause of Africans and Blacks anywhere in the world by consistently whining off the white institutions and power. The second thing, Black people have got to understand that everywhere, whether born in America, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, anywhere, without a proper working and flourishing Africa, they will continue to be seen the same way they see Africans. The whole paradigm shift in how Africans are seen and they're treated is when Africa begins to develop, so that Africans in the diaspora can come back home and feel they will live. But if they know that they only have to leave Europe to have a decent life, but substandard to the white people's life, they will always have an inferiority complex. They will always feel they are undermined. They will always feel that they are always treated unfairly. So my view is that there has to be leaders here to ensure that this continent works. There was a time where the Chinese and the Asians, much general, were treated like debt. They were treated in the same and looked in the same view as they look Africa. Dark continent, backward, and all of that. Up until China pulled 500 million Chinese, and by extension, the whole of Asia, out of poverty by the sheer weight and power of the Chinese Communist Party. And it changed the power of how we see Chinese everywhere in the world today. We grew up, just used to watch their karate movies, the Jackie Chan's, but there was nothing of interest that was coming from China that you could aspire to. But today, China and Chinese, they go everywhere. They own, they control, they are influential, and they know if anything doesn't work anywhere in the world, they will go back to their thriving China. Japan is working, South Korea is working, Taiwan is working, the Asian countries are working. And it gives them some status when they go in these Western countries, especially white countries. So we have to be obsessed with the idea of developing Africa. Even we look at Africa and feel ashamed. Even us in Africa, there are still countries that are failed states in Africa. There's still conflict where we are still trying to establish just mere stability, just stability. There are still countries in Africa where we must still build institutions for political stability. The world is now talking AI. It has gone beyond technology. They're talking now at how does technology get them to Mars. But in Africa, we're still fighting tribal wars, regional wars. We're still fighting religious wars. So you cannot do anything in the continent when you have not silenced the guns, when you have not created the political institutions to create stable governments that are routinely being able to change without shedding of blood, where there are institutions to hold those in power accountable in terms of taking them to court, regulatory institutions, banking institutions, and a variety of other institutions that are just a prerequisite for any stable and developing country. Now, when you have Africa at peace with itself, a developing Africa, then it's easy for you living in the USA to say, my children cannot take this. The next generation of children, I'm buying a house in Swaziland, I'm coming back to my people, and my children will grow up as Swazis, or they'll grow up as Tswanas, as Kenyans and everything. But who looks at Africa and feels inspired? Even those Africans who come to Europe and meet other Africans, they face tribalism, they face xenophobia, because we are just a dark continent, but with so much potential. So to me, to fight racism in white world cannot be separated to the agenda to establish, to develop Africa, to ensure that this continent grows, this continent is prosperous, this continent can absorb all its Black people all over the world and tell them, come home.
It actually took countries deliberately in the parliament saying, we want to modernize. China did it, Japan did it. There's one point in time when they said, no, we now want to modernize. And you don't see any African nation doing that. And also, do you know that in the US Constitution, they have written in there the fact that the government will support research. In Africa, where have you seen an African nation doing anything about research? There's no, I don't know whether it's because we don't understand.
Let me say, sorry to interrupt you. Yeah. You know, when they look at the metric information in the world, they say information, by the way, especially in research, in science and innovation, when they're looking at research and where the sources of scientific research, the kind of information that advances a civilization. And I'm talking about small countries, I'm talking about an entire civilization that leapfrogs it to the next stage. They look at Europe, they look at America, Canada, and all of that. And then in Africa, there's a small dot in South Africa that, you'll get some few there. Otherwise, the continent is just a dark place in terms of research and information and innovation. And just go beyond that. Look at energy. Look at the continent when it's lit up. And you look at the map of the world and where the lights are coming from. In large parts of Africa, it's dark, but all over Europe, you can tell it's lit up, so much energy being used. Talk of travel. Look at where are the airplanes going. They're going in Europe and then a few. So the people know we don't matter in the scale of the world. There's a quote I like by Professor Lumumba. He says, even militarily, Europe can bomb us into Stone Age. And it's stuck with me that America, one country, can fight this continent at the continental scale, the entire continent, and bomb us into Stone Age. Yeah. How much we don't matter to the world.
Yeah. You know what? In Botswana, and I know I'm going to catch a lot of flack for saying this, but let me just put it out there so that we can now change gears. In Botswana, people are talking about, okay, let's go back to our culture. Let's go back to our culture. And when you try to listen, okay, what culture are they talking about? They'll say, no, we must marry more than one wife. When you're like, I thought you were going to say, what are we going to do about all these fatherless kids that we are not helping their mothers raise, who now turn into tsotsis on street corners? Something, you know what I'm saying? It's like, I honestly don't know, because maybe it's because I'm a woman and I'm beginning to feel a certain type of way about men who have been leading for a very long time and we are not seeing the results. I'm saying all this to say, where are the women in the greater scheme of things? Because whenever men get together, they talk about manly things. They talk about, they can fight. They'll be the ones wearing the helmets and the AK-47s trying to fight America, the whole continent. But at the same time, you cannot have progress if your women are still subservient to you. At least that's my view. So I just want to hear what you have to say about the state of women in Africa.
Can you just allow me to have a bite on the issue of culture?
Yeah.
I've always had a problem with this very myopic and narrow understanding of culture. Culture is a subtotal of all that we are as a people. It advance. We must advance with time. Take all of those things that are good with culture and advance them and ensure that they stay with us and continue to the next level. And all of the things that are bad with culture, we just leave them. They're a relic of the past and we must not be married. I saw someone say tradition or the culture is like blackmail from the dead. I'll give you an example. Most of our cultures in Southern Africa, when you had twins, you were considered bad omen and one had to be killed. Why are we not practicing that today? Because we had to let go of certain things that don't work. In our culture, in my culture especially, there was a thing that called a woman who doesn't listen must be beaten. We've let go of that. It was our culture at some point that if I come to your family and I marry you and you can't give me kids, then I can marry your sister, irrespective of whether or not she agrees or not. So there are many of these things that we have let go because time and civilization moves forward. We want to take what's good with certain cultures and leave what's not. So I feel some people are imprisoned by the idea that every culture is good. No, a culture must not be linked to one thing. A culture is your language, is your history, is your environment, is how you interface with each other and all of that. And it evolves. Culture evolves. So, and also we don't eat culture. I don't like the concept that I'm hungry, but I still have my culture. Instead, we must look at culture in this way. It's not African to let another person go hungry when I have something. It's not our culture. And that is the good thing that we must take on board and never abandon and get embraced to this Western idea of individualism. It's all about me. Second thing in our culture that is beautiful, that we must promote, is that thing that I rise with society. I don't rise out of society. I can't be the only one with a skyscraper in my village and everyone is poor, doesn't have water, doesn't have electricity, and I'm the only one who's rich. I want to grow with my family, with my community. We grow together. We are one. Those are beautiful things of our culture we must be talking about. Secondly, I will not allow, my child must be raised by the community, which means if my child is still stealing, and I go to that woman, I say, thank you so much for disciplining this one because he's your child, is my child. That's the part of our culture we're promoting. You know, there are many aspects of our culture that are good, that we should be, but we can't be imprisoned by the idea that we must be marrying 15 wives. In which economy? in which economy? Because in these economies, if we want to be living and thriving properly, any more head you bring to the family, never mind wives, even children, you can't afford to have 3 children, at least in Swaziland. You can't afford, at least now, unless you don't care about how they go to school and all of. So I'm saying that I get frustrated sometimes with their very narrow look at this whole thing about culture. But I do not want to be seen to be westernized in this respect by saying we must reject. No, I'm saying we must evolve this culture and take what's good from our culture and leave what's bad in our culture. And it takes me to the issue of women. You know, in our culture, women, especially old women, bokoko, what we call, I don't know what you call it in.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. Grandmothers.
Grandmothers. They were revered and very important in society, in the community, and in our family. Especially the aunties at home. When the auntie say something, the home shakes, because the auntie is a very important person in the family. The old women, they tell stories, they raise kids, they ensure that they bring harmony. When I'm fighting with my woman and I go to Gogo, I go to my grandmother, and she's the one who's able to. No, we didn't take grandmothers to old age homes, at least not in Southern Africa, at least. In fact, I could even be controversial and say in whole Africa. We believe they are treasures of information, of history that we must stay with. That our grandchildren, when we're fighting with our children, they go to the grandmother and they say, my father is beating me. And the woman says, hey, you can't teach me, you can't touch my grandson. That's how important women have been in our African culture. But we have not wanted to elevate that part of our culture. And we've relegated women into the fringes, partly because we've gotten too westernized, you know, with all of these with those values from the Western world that are talking about individualism, personal glory, materialism, and all of that. We've embraced that. Yet, I argue very strongly that there's a very good place for women in our society, in our family, but we are still challenged when it comes to political power. And it's not in terms of quotas and in terms of just showing face, but really, really empowering women to be influential in our politics. But I just lastly, and I know this one is very controversial, both men and women do not want to address the church. The church has not played its role in empowering. All of these problems we're dealing with, the church goes and bastardizes women and shoves down patriarchal values. And anything we're doing on the side, promoting women, giving women affirmation, every Sunday, the church rose back that how many women are in leadership positions in the church? How many women-centered teachings are being taught in the church? So the church is a very important institution in Africa and very influential. If we do not have women occupying positions in the church, leading the church, changing how the church communicates its message, then whatever we're attempting gets to be rolled back every Sunday. So my challenge is that let's ensure that we take the good from our culture, evolve it, which places women in very important position. Let's ensure that women get much more power in our politics, in our economy, and generally policies must be women friendly.
Yeah, this is very refreshing to hear men say that, because now you've taken care of the next 3-4 questions that I was going to throw your way. Let me tell you what my gripe is. I know you have made your position very clear about women, how we need to be allowed to advance as well, because I mean, who in the 21st century wants to be treated like a child? Here's my problem, and this is something that African men are refusing to see or to consider, or maybe they don't even know. We need to look at the ways we traditionally acquired wives. It was not fair because it was all arranged, forced, and some women were bought. And there was even cultures where women could be abducted from a street. And when you look at all these four ways that different African societies used to acquire wives, you will realize that it was the same way as slavery, how people used to get slaves. They used to go and raid for slaves. They used to go and buy slaves in a market. You understand? And when you look at women, what the role of a woman was as a wife, you had to do all this labor. You had to build houses. You had to do everything. All the agricultural labor fell on you, and raising of children and all these things. And it was and you didn't get paid for it, just like in slavery, where you just provide free domestic and agricultural labor. So I would really like African men to see that the reason why we are crying, even in the 21st century, is because we are looking at the tradition. That I'm not saying all of the African marriage was bad, but I'm trying to say that is how we were left behind. We were denied seats at the Nkundla where the decisions were made. And so for as long as we don't, it's easy to say women who talk about their rights have been westernized or whatever, but it is a very genuine concern. Even us as modern women, I may not personally be a victim of all those things, but it is happening to so many other women. And we need people like you who are forward thinking to spread the message to say, no, guys, when you are with your buddies, sometimes, throw it in there. They may not necessarily like the idea of having to cede power or at least share it with a woman. But Africa will never get anywhere without the full participation of women in the political sphere, economic sphere, everywhere. Because if you're a king, yeah.
I agree with you 100%. The thing about women is that they transcend the politics. They just at the social fabric of our society. You just made a very interesting example of how we used to acquire wives. And I'm telling you now, in Malawi, there's a woman who was awarded something for ending child marriages. Their children today were still being married to old men, 16-year-old child getting married to a 45-something-year-old. And I mean, that's a child, can't even make a decision around who they love or not, but we're still getting into a marriage. Our king married a 16-year-old child when she was 30-something years old. You can imagine the power relations there. There are some facts and I hope I'm not mistaken in this one. Your viewers will have to forgive me if I'm wrong. But I think I remember in some parts of Somalia, there is some genital mutilations that happens. So the struggles of women are so many. They go beyond the politics. You just mentioned how women get to be but also some women get to stay in abusive relationships, polygamous relationships, where the man just treats them like debt. Up until recently, most of our countries, in Swaziland in particular, they didn't have marital rape as an offense. Married women could not refuse consent. They are married to sexual assault. So I'm just saying that there's a lot. There are some women. I mean, at a higher scale, there's the whole thing of GBH, gender-based violence, which shows itself and manifests itself in Swaziland as femicide, where men feel so control of women's bodies that if they cannot get you, then no one else will. And when those marriages and those relationships break down, then your life is now in danger. So
that is a plague in Botswana. That's a plague. It's a pandemic in Botswana.
Same thing in Swaziland. Yeah, same thing in Swaziland, So women still have got to seek male validation, what to wear, how to behave, even in meetings. And I don't even have to, if I bring men and women and they have to sit and talk somewhere, that the women will just shy away from speaking. Never mind what they say, but because they're trying not to hog headlines, not to be the main center of attraction, the men must speak. So you can tell that our problems with women go beyond just, they're at the center of the social fabric of our culture and our politics and all of that.
This has been truly amazing talking to you. Now to just give me your last word before we end this, because my mind is just blown. I have nothing else to say.
Yeah, no, look, I'm really fascinated by the idea of African integration and as your area of focus. I do think that I would like to throw a challenge to the billionaires of the diaspora, Black billionaires, that they are our African representative of us here in the continent. They must refuse to be assimilated to the materialistic culture of the Western societies. They must ensure that they plant back to their continent so that we can have global influence as well. The people in China must learn about Africa. We must have a television station that gets to be broadcast in China, in Saudi Arabia, in Russia, in America, the same way we consume their Al Jazeera, their BBC and all of that. And that way, there must be cross-pollination of cultural influences. The second thing is that the degradation of the Black man through music. There is one genre of music that we Blacks and claim to own. It's hip hop. But we are not using hip hop as a cultural tool to sell us Black people as dignified people. You don't have, and I know that hip hop heads will fight me about this, but there's a point to be made about the contemporary hip hop that's represented by
gangsterism,
sexism,
yeah,
tattoos to the face, and all of that. And that really devalues the Black man and by extension the continent. And I do think that with just those two, we'll begin to learn each other more as Africans when we are interfacing each other more. When we break the barriers of communication, we are deliberate in trying to learn each other's languages. And that way we get to learn each other's histories and politics.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your contribution. And remember that this program is sponsored by the Movement in Omaha for Racial Equity. So it will be posted on their website as well as their YouTube channel. Enjoy yourself in Swaziland. And I think Africa needs more people like you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.